Hi, my name is Shamas, and this is my theory of knowledge presentation that I have chosen to talk about the effect of language on ways of thinking and thought processes. So, for my real life situation for this presentation, I decided to focus on my French grandmother, who was born in France and spent her whole childhood in France, speaking French, who moved to an English speaking part of North America as an adult. So as an adult, she's completely fluent in both French and English, speaks both of them constantly, depending on who she's talking to. There are many people in my family who speak both languages. And I've noticed that whenever she speaks French, her attitude is much shorter and she is more curt with people and generally has a much shorter temper. So, from this real life situation, I have devised the knowledge question: to what extent does language influence personality? So there are two things that I wanted to define in this knowledge question. So personality is the quality or state of a person, and also how they are influenced by the world around them and how they take in information in order to regurgitate that back out to the world. And language is defined simply as words or signs that people use to express thoughts and feelings. So that's just the language. It is just the words, nothing about the words, simply how they are formed. So in this presentation, I explore one area of knowledge and two ways of knowing. So the area of knowledge that I choose to explore is human sciences, due to the fact that this is, it's a observation on the human condition and why humans act a certain way. So all of my real life examples and evidence come from essentially psychology. It's mostly psychological experiments. And my ways of knowing that I explore in this presentation are language and sense perception. Language being, in the knowledge question, it's the main focus on the presentation and how language itself affects how information is interpreted and regurgitated and processed by a person. And sense perception is also explored because sense perception is how one perceives the world around them and how one's sense perception is altered by language and how the language alters the sense perception and therefore the personality in return. So to get into my knowledge claim is that it is the language itself that causes a change in personality or way of thinking. So they claim that is the syntax, it is how sentences or words themselves are structured that influence how one thinks. For this argument, I support it with the book Why Greeks Interrupt Each Other. So this book does not necessarily deal with the knowledge claim that I've stated, but it does provide pertinent information to it. So this book talks about how a sentence in Greek, the Greek language, begins with a conjugated verb. Conjugated verb is the first thing that you hear out of a person's mouth. So that verb often dictates where the sentence is going to go. So therefore, people speaking Greek or listening to someone speak Greek can gather much more information from just that first word than, say, someone speaking English, where the verb is deeper into the sentence. So because they can derive so much information from just the first word, Greeks tend to interrupt each other a lot more because they don't need to hear the full sentence. So therefore, Greek people would be considered more rude when speaking Greek. So therefore, if a person who speaks Greek, also speaks English, they would have to be much more patient speaking English because they cannot derive the information necessary to interrupt someone from simply that first word. So therefore, in this scenario, the language itself, the syntax of the language, would affect directly a person's personality or way of thinking by not forcing them, but allowing them to be more rude and more interrupting. So this claim includes the area of knowledge of human sciences, not by being a concrete psychological experiment, but it is an observation of the language and human condition and why humans choose to interact a certain way. And it includes language because it's the study not of multilingualism, but a single language. However, I can take this study of a single language and apply it to a scenario of a bilingual or multilingual speaker. And it also includes sense perception by talking about how the Greeks perceive the world around them, not as individuals, but as a general rule, Greeks being much more rude and interrupting. Now, for my counterclaim, I contend that it's not the language that influences the personality, but it is the culture behind the language and the culture that one associates with a language that influences the personality. So, for this counterclaim, I take evidence from the book One Individual, Two Identities Frame Switching Among Biculturals. So, this book contains 3 psychological experiments that look at differences in personality between bilinguals who speak 2 different languages. So, in most cases, Spanish and English. So, they found in these experiments that differences in reactions and interpretations to data were found among biculturals, not necessarily bilinguals. This means that people who have experienced 2 different cultures in their lifetime will experience a change in personality when speaking one language versus another, rather than a person who grew up in one culture but speaks 2 languages. They will not experience a difference in personality or way of thinking. So, the one experiment I would like to focus on is an experiment where biculturals, in this case, Spanish and English speakers, were shown advertisements, mainly with a woman on the advertisement, and they were told to describe the woman in Spanish, and some were told to describe the woman in English. And the ones who described the woman in Spanish described her as stronger, more self sufficient, while those who described her in English used more submissive or weaker verbs or adjectives to describe the person in these ads. So this shows that for whatever reason these people choose to associate associate the Spanish language with being stronger or more self-sufficient rather than weaker, more submissive in the English language. So it is not the language that directly affects the way that these people process these advertisements, but it is rather the culture behind the language that determines how they perceive the information. So this claim includes the human sciences with 3 concrete studies resulting in the same result as a counterclaim. The language, it focuses on multilinguals, people who speak multiple languages, not just Spanish and English, but also other languages. And sense perception, it showed them very similar stimuli and received different responses based on the language. So the stimuli was not changed very much, but the filter through which the people the different saw the ads through the different languages changed, and therefore their interpretation of it changed. So in conclusion, I say that it is not the language that impacts the subject and their way of thinking or thought processes, but it is the culture that is the reason for their shift in personality, and the language is simply a side effect of the culture that they choose to view certain stimuli through. So therefore, in relation to my real life scenario, my French grandmother relates harshness or sternness to France and the French culture due to a much rougher upbringing in France than the life that she has in English. So the language does not reflect any aspect of the personality she associates with it, and it is simply a side effect of the culture that she associates with the language.